Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of House Resolution 683. First, I want to thank Chairman Lamar Smith and Subcommittee Chair Trent Franks of the Judiciary Committee for all their work on this resolution. I appreciate it so much. We have come together across party lines to show that no matter what side of the aisle we sit on, Congress can make amends for the past, no matter how long ago those violations occurred. It is because we have worked together in a bipartisan way that we will make history today. Today, for the first time in 130 years, the House of Representatives will vote on a bill that expresses regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the most discriminatory acts in American history. Over a century ago, the Chinese came here in search of a better life. During the California Gold Rush, the Chinese came to the United States to make something of themselves. Their blood, sweat, and tears built the first transcontinental railroad, connecting the people of our nation. They opened our mines, constructed the levees, and became the backbone of farm production. Their efforts helped build America. But as the economy soured in the 1870s, the Chinese became scapegoats. They were called racial slurs, were spat upon in the streets, and even brutally murdered. The harsh conditions they faced were evident in the halls of Congress. By the time 1882 came around, members of Congress were competing with each other to get the most discriminatory law passed and routinely made speeches on the floor against the so-called Mongolian horde. Representative Albert Shelby Willis from Kentucky fought particularly hard for Chinese Exclusion Act. In his floor speech, he said the Chinese were an invading race. He called them aliens with sordid and un-Republican habits. He declared that the Pacific states had been cursed with the evils of Chinese immigration and that they disturbed the peace and order of society. The official House committee report accompanying the bill claimed that the Chinese, and I quote, retain their distinctive peculiarities and characteristics, refusing to assimilate themselves to our institutions and remaining a separate and distinct class entrenched behind immovable prejudices, that their ignorance or disregard of sanitary laws, as evidenced in their habits of life, breeds disease, pestilence, and death, unquote. And so, on April 17, 1882, under a simple suspension of the rules, the House passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It prevented them from becoming naturalized citizens, it prevented them from ever having the right to vote, and it prevented the Chinese, and the Chinese alone, from immigrating. But this was only the beginning. As the years passed, the House built upon this act, increasing the discriminatory restrictions on the Chinese. 2 years later, the House made clear that any ethnically Chinese labor, even if they weren't from China, but from somewhere like Hong Kong or the Philippines, were banned from U.S. shores. 4 years later, the House passed the Scott Act. This bill prohibited all Chinese laborers from re-entering the United States if they ever left, even if they were legal residents in the U.S., and even if they had the certificates of return that should have guaranteed their right of return. This prevented approximately 20,000 legal U.S. residents who had abroad, including 600 on ships literally en route back to the United States, from returning to their families or their homes. With little floor debate, the Scott Act passed the House unanimously. In 1892, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was set to expire, the House extended it for another decade, but it increased restrictions further. It made the Chinese the only residents who could not receive bail after applying for a writ of habeas corpus, that is, to protest an unjust imprisonment. It made them the only people in America who had to carry papers or certificates of residence with them at all times. If they couldn't produce the proper documents, authorities threw them into prison or out of the country, regardless of whether they were U.S. citizens or not. Legally, the only means by which this could be stopped is if a white person testified on their behalf. In 1898, the U.S. annexed Hawaii and the Philippines, making them U.S. territories. And while other residents of the territories could come and go between their home and the U.S., who did the House make sure to exclude? Only the Chinese. Then in 1904, the House made the Chinese Exclusion Act permanent. This act lasted for 60 long years. It was not until 1943 that this law was repealed. But it was only because of World War II when the United States needed to maintain a critical military alliance with China. U.S. enemies were pointing to the Chinese Exclusion Act as proof that the U.S. was anti-Chinese, and the U.S. had to erase that perception. However, Congress made no formal acknowledgement that these laws were wrong. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first and only federal law in our history that excluded a single group of people from immigration on no basis other than their race. And the effects of this act produced deep scars on the Chinese American community. Families were split apart permanently. Without the ability to naturalize as citizens and to vote, the community was disenfranchised. Because immigration had been so severely restricted, few women could come, and the ratio of males to females was as high as 20-1. Many Chinese American males could not have families and were forced to die completely alone. If they did try to marry, they were forced to go abroad, and families were separated. The family of Jean Quan, mayor of Oakland, had been here legally since 1880. Her father went abroad to marry a woman in China in 1920, but had to leave her behind along with their children. When the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed over 25 years later, his wife was finally able to come and have Jean in the United States, but the siblings did not know each other for decades. The Chinese, like my grandfather, did not have the legal right to become naturalized citizens. He had been here legally since 1904, but unlike non-Chinese immigrants, he was forced to register and carry a certificate of residence at all times for almost 40 years, or else be deported. He could only be saved if a white person vouched for him. These laws are why we ask for this expression of regret. Last October, the U.S. Senate did its part to write history by passing their own resolution of regret for these hateful laws. It did so unanimously with bipartisan support. And today, the House should also issue its expression of regret. It is for my grandfather and for all Chinese Americans who were for 6 decades by the U.S. government that the land of the free wasn't open to them that we must pass this resolution. We must finally and formally acknowledge these ugly laws that were incompatible with America's founding principles. We must express the sincere regret that Chinese Americans deserve. By doing so, we will acknowledge that discrimination has no place in our society, and we will reaffirm our strong commitment to preserving the civil rights and constitutional protections for all people of every color, every race, and from every background. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Lady,